Committee postponed further proceedings on amendment log number 461R1 offered by Mr. Crow and shall now resume those proceedings. This is the amendment regarding troops in Afghanistan. The question occurs on the amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
Aye.
Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis.
Aye.
Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin.
Aye.
Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson.
Aye.
Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper.
Aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Lambourne votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego.
Aye.
Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks.
No.
Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna.
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating.
Aye.
Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella.
Aye.